Welcome to the Lila Acheson Wallace Wing for 20th Century Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm Philippe de Montebello, Director of the Metropolitan Museum. Named for its principal donor, co-founder of Reader's Digest, and one of the museum's greatest benefactors, the 110,000 square foot wing inaugurates permanent exhibition space for the Metropolitan's 20th Century Art collection. It reconfirms the museum's commitment to the art of our time and honors a unique patron. Our tour of this new wing will be primarily chronological and divided into two parts. The first, covering the period 1900 to 1940, followed by 1940 to the present. Our two programs document the first installation in the Lila Acheson Wallace wing. The Metropolitan's collection of 20th century art is quite extensive, and thus the installation will change periodically. I urge you to visit the galleries in person if at all possible. Our tour begins with these works of Pierre Bonnard, which are characterized by a patterning that comes out of his adaptation of the pointillist technique of post-impressionism. He uses short dashes of various colors to create his forms. Bonnard has been called an intimist painter, and he delighted in portraying his friends and relatives in scenes of domesticity, families gathering for a meal or resting in the garden, as seen in Terrace at Vernon. The dressing room of 1914 is a carefully detailed interior showing the artist's favorite model, Marthe, whom he was to marry in 1925. The abstract tradition, so strong in the 20th century, was developed by Wassily Kandinsky, a young Russian artist whose work was also shown at the Armory Show of 1913. Although Kandinsky began his adult life as a lawyer, he eventually turned to painting and moved to Munich, where he early on came under the influence of German expressionism and symbolism. Kandinsky eventually developed a new pictorial language, spiritual in intent, emotional in expression, and very abstract in vision. His Garden of Love shows an unreal landscape which surrounds the centrally placed sun, pulsating with rays of red. The forms, while not specific, still suggest a scenario. The garden is peopled by three pairs of embracing figures: a green and blue reclining couple above the sun, a black and white couple also reclining at the lower right, and a third, smaller pair seated at the left. The garden also contains animals, certainly a snake, and perhaps a horse and a dog. Nasturtiums and the Dance is by Henri Matisse, who along with Picasso is considered perhaps the greatest painter of the 20th century. The theme of this painting is a picture within a picture. Matisse's early painting, Dance, a section of which is seen close up and resting against a studio wall. In front of it, a large jar bubbling with nasturtiums sits on a sculptor's turning table, while at the left, cropped by the picture's margin, is a wooden chair with a blue and white striped cushion. Although the forms are more recognizable than those in the Kandinsky we just looked at, we can see that Matisse has simplified his forms into flat color shapes and minimized the effect of space and perspective. The Metropolitan Museum is especially fortunate to have as part of its collection these 5 extraordinary figure paintings by Pablo Picasso. Arranged chronologically, this wall is certainly one of the glories of the installation. Let's start with Blind Man's Meal, an example of his blue period. The painting has essentially been rendered in one tonality. Painted when the artist was just 22, the subject matter is one which Picasso will come back to again and again in his long career. The man depicted is one of the poor beggars of Barcelona. His eyes are deeply shaded, really giving you the sense that he is blind. His fingers are even elegant, elongated, and he feels for his meager repast with them. The hands of the actor, painted 1 year later, are also elongated, yet they've taken on a more affected pose in this depiction of the tall, gaunt, almost gangly thespian seen leaning toward the audience as he delivers his lines. The tonalities are from Picasso's Rose period, and the space and forms of the scene are at first difficult to read. But if you look down to the lower right-hand corner, you can see a prompter's box and another pair of hands directing the actor on the stage. This is the clue to the painting, and once this space is deciphered, everything else falls into place. In Gertrude Stein, completed in 1906, Picasso is really on the verge of cubism. Stein posed for this portrait 90 times in a large broken armchair in Picasso's haphazard living quarters. The shapes are blockier, more simplified, and the quality of the face mask-like. After one of the later sittings, Picasso suddenly painted out the whole head. A few months later, without seeing Gertrude Stein again, he repainted the face, changed its angle, and presented it as a mask. When an observer remarked, "It doesn't look like her," Picasso responded, "It will." In La Coiffure, we again see working-class people performing daily activities. Painted the same year as the Gertrude Stein, it retains the tonalities of salmon, terracotta, and pinks from the Rose period. A decade later, in 1923, Picasso painted this engaging classical portrait of a dancer, a woman in white. Her stockiness goes back to the pre-Cubist period, and the profile and physiognomy are based on classical Greek sculpture. The Mediterranean tones, the freely drawn black outlines of her hair, and the white wash which was applied over the surface of the painting give the figure a mystical, ethereal quality. Cubism was the first and most radical revolution in the visual arts of the 20th century. Both Picasso and Georges Braque were leaders of the Cubist movement. On this wall, we display 5 Cubist still lifes, appropriately commencing with a Braque and a Picasso. Both paintings show an arrangement of objects on a table. We're looking at them from above. The forms have been simplified into basic geometric shapes, and their planes shifted in space so that they look fractured and spread apart. The colors are the muted earth tones favored at this time by both artists. These are followed by a horizontal still life by Jacques Villon of 1912. It is in the colors of Cubism, but the forms are more rounded, more decorative. Working at the same time in France was Jacques Lipchitz, a sculptor from Lithuania who was a friend of the Cubists in Paris. This marble sculpture, The Seated Bather, is particularly interesting because it was finished quite recently, actually in 1972, the year before Lipchitz's death. But what is significant is that it was conceived originally in 1917 and shows his interpretation of the Cubist tradition. The sculpture is flanked by 2 more Cubist still lifes, on the left by Jean Metzinger, and on the right, a later Picasso, larger and more decorative than the earlier examples. In this same room, we have a wonderful piece by another Cubist sculptor, Alexander Archipenko. It's a gondolier, and you see him with his pole cutting a strong diagonal, which is picked up in the painting on the right by the American Lionel Feininger. It was done in 1915. The alley of trees not only repeats the accents of the Archipenko, but also adds something that you don't have in Cubism: motion. Max Weber's Athletic Contest, painted in the same year, conveys movement as well. The German artist Paul Klee was a contemporary of Weber's, and the Metropolitan is proud to include as part of this new wing the Berggruen Klee collection, located on the mezzanine level. Klee's distinct style combined the playfulness and simplicity of children's art and the ritual of primitive art, with an occasional satirical spirit. The present selection focuses on the last 15 years of the artist's career and includes the two gouaches, Boy in a Fancy Dress and Athlete's Head, both from the early 30s, a particularly happy period in the artist's life. In this gallery, 60 paintings by 47 artists from the museum's collection survey aspects of American paintings from 1905 through 1940. While Europeans were forging the innovations of modern art, American artists were developing their own style along more national lines. This room speaks to and reflects the American experience up until the Second World War. Jonas Lie's The Conquerors, Culebra Cut, Panama Canal, was painted in 1913 and purchased by the museum the following year. On first glance, there are many elements that are related to 19th century Impressionism, but this dramatic landscape painting shows a real transition in the American artist's attitude toward nature, a new kind of landscape. Rather than showing man overwhelmed by the grandeur of nature, this painting is a glorification of man's ingenuity and technical prowess in the face of nature. Charles Acheson also shows the influence of Impressionism in this shimmering scene painted during the fall of 1918 at the end of World War I. The flags of the European Allies were suspended in a parade above Fifth Avenue, and their many colors create a pleasing visual display. Almost obscured are the pedestrians and vehicles of the busy city below. Painted just a year later is this luminous work by George Bellows. It's 1919, the first year of peace. It shows a crowd watching a tennis match between the two champions that year, Bill Tilden and William Johnson. It glows with the late afternoon light which streams through the trees, creating strong diagonal patterns in the composition. Although Bellows did many studies and several etchings based on this composition, the free, painterly brushstrokes give the work an immediacy that is uniquely American. This is Mr. and Mrs. Chesterdale Dining Out by Guy Pen Dubois. Chesterdale was a wealthy art patron who was a great supporter of Dubois and also gave several important works to the museum. It is interesting to compare this with Chaim Gross's 1928 sculpture East Side Girl, depicting a young working girl from the lower part of Manhattan. She wears a cloche hat similar to that of the elegant Mrs. Chesterdale. Abstract art began to assert itself during the 1920s. These three still lifes, done in the 1920s, show those beginnings. Stuart Davis's Percolator, another Davis Edison Mazda, and Edward McKnight Kauffer's Sunflowers. We can see the influence of Cubism in all these works, and while the McKnight Kauffer is of a subject we associate with the 19th century artist Vincent van Gogh, the Stuart Davis shows the introduction of a new still life subject taken from the objects we use in our everyday life. Undoubtedly, this light bulb in Edison Mazda is one of the first depictions of an electric light bulb in art. By far the greatest painter of the American urban scene was Edward Hopper, and here we have his From Williamsburg Bridge of 1928. Hopper evoked light with powerful visual effect. By using deep shadows to heighten the intense clarity of light, Hopper created contrast that lent drama to even the most ordinary urban scenes. Here, the upper stories of the four facades are unified in a pattern that dominates the eccentricities of their individual architecture. The impression of silence and the feeling of isolation, both so characteristic of Hopper's paintings, are somehow reinforced by the presence of a solitary woman seated on a windowsill. This is paired with Hopper's Lighthouse at Two Lights, and together they demonstrate that no other American artist was as great a master of painted light in or out of doors. In the 1930s, narrative painting, which was such a strong tendency in American art, continues alongside the developments in abstract art. Peter Bloom, who was influenced by surrealist artists such as Salvador Dali and René Magritte, tells in his South of Scranton the story of the artist's automobile trip, as he says, slowly up to the coal fields around Scranton, down to the steel mills of Bethlehem, and finally down south by way of the Shenandoah Valley to Charleston, South Carolina. There, he watched sailors on a battleship doing complicated calisthenic exercises on its enormous deck. In this picture, the landscape details and the street scene leading off the dock are dislocated props, much smaller in scale to the sailors, who are seen like gravity-defying acrobats leaping above the ship's deck. In the same narrative fashion, and using a purely American theme, is Grant Wood's The Ride of Paul Revere of 1931. This popular image depicts the historic event which took place on April 18, 1775. The precisionist style of Wood's bird's-eye view is so sharp that it renders the delightful but contrived scene completely convincingly. Light falling on the ribbon of road marks Revere's route, which begins at the right with distant flecks on the dark horizon and moves past the inn to the theatrically moonlit foreground with the spired church and tiny rocking horse rider. Many American artists ventured beyond the urban setting for their subject matter. They sought in a more realistic fashion to anchor their art to American scenes, specifically the American landscape. Some went west to New Mexico, Arizona, and Mexico proper. One of those was the great American painter Georgia O'Keeffe, whose Rancho's church you see here. This was painted in Taos, New Mexico, where O'Keeffe lived most of her adult life. You see here several well-known paintings of her beloved Southwest, including From the Faraway Nearby, showing bleached bones in the desert. A Storm in Her Black Place of 1944. A dramatic cow's skull titled Red, White, and Blue in typically American colors. And an enlarged iris of 1926 entitled Black Iris. Georgia O'Keeffe was married to the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, and we can see the influence of photography on the works hanging here. If you will permit me a brief detour from our survey of pre-war American painting, I think this would be a good time to look at some of the other works in the Alfred Stieglitz collection, which was bequeathed to the Metropolitan. Stieglitz promoted in particular 5 American artists, all younger than himself: his wife-to-be, Georgia O'Keeffe, John Marin, Arthur Dove, Charles Demuth, and Marsden Hartley, whose work is represented here, including his 1914 portrait of a German officer. This abstract work was inspired by the death of a handsome German friend who was killed in action. His initials and age can be found at the lower left and right. Hartley created this portrait through an assemblage of military insignia that belonged to the officer, rather than by recreating a likeness of the person. John Marin painted a number of watercolors, including these 2 wonderful images of New York City, Brooklyn Bridge of 1912 and St. Paul's, Manhattan, painted 2 years later. They show his absorption of the formal aspects of Cubism and Futurism. Charles Demuth's The Figure 5 in Gold is a conceptualized poster portrait of the American physician, poet William Carlos Williams, a close friend and associate of Demuth's. The painting is based on a specific poem by Williams. I quote, "Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold, on a red fire truck moving tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city." You can see that Demuth creates the impression of noise and visual effects in the diminishing number 5 and the diagonal lines that reach to the corners of the composition. Right next to the Stieglitz rooms is the Decorative and Industrial Design Gallery. From its inception in 1870, the Metropolitan has promoted and collected contemporary design and architecture. The present installation traces both decorative and industrial designs for seating in this century. There are some wonderful pieces on display. To conclude our survey of the Metropolitan's American paintings in the pre-war period, let's look at some examples done under the auspices of the WPA, which supported and commissioned works by painters and sculptors in the late 30s and early 40s. This construction of both painting and sculpture by Charles Biederman was a WPA work completed in 1938. The smaller canvas to the left, Still Life, Seashell, and Map, was done by David Smith, the great American sculptor, in 1933 when he was still primarily a painter. The background is a map of the Virgin Islands. The large form is a seashell, and its jagged edges really give you a foretaste of the jagged edges that will be in his very great sculptures. This large mural, made for Studio B of WNYC in New York, was painted by Stuart Davis in 1939. You recall his earlier abstractions, Edison Mazda and Percolator, in the small still lifes. Here he becomes almost completely abstract and more confident in his style. He is creating an imagery almost exclusively out of flat shapes that refer variously to jazz music and to urban street signage. Many people are surprised to learn that this 1938 painting is by the abstract expressionist painter Willem de Kooning. When he first came to New York from Holland in 1926, the first place he came to was this museum, and he studied the Bosco Reale murals from Pompeii that are on the first floor of the Metropolitan. If you look at those murals, you'll see the same tonalities, the same transparencies of drapery, and the same wide, staring eyes. Of course, we'll see more de Koonings when we come to the post-war period. That concludes our first program on the Lila Acheson Wallace wing of 20th century art. In our next half hour, we'll look at painting and sculpture from 1940 to the present, a period well represented in the Metropolitan's collection. Welcome to the second half of our tour through the Lila Acheson Wallace wing of 20th century art. I'm Philippe de Montebello, director of the Metropolitan. And in this program, we're going to look at works from 1940 to the present. Lila Acheson Wallace, co-founder of Reader's Digest and the principal donor of this wing, was one of the greatest benefactors in the history of this museum. A passionate collector, she was committed to art in her own time, and she also provided funds that continue to contribute to the growth of our 20th century collections. She gave the funds for the 32 galleries of Egyptian art, also named in her honor, and the fresh flowers that will always welcome our visitors in the Great Hall. Painting and sculpture in the past 40 years have produced some remarkable and indeed revolutionary developments in the creation of images and have altered profoundly our way of seeing art. But let's begin with what is closer to the end of a tradition. Thomas Hart Benton's July Hay of 1943 cast the farmlands and folk myths of his native state into a heroic mold. The composition itself is expressionist, with its free-flowing, undulating forms, and Benton has closely observed all the details of nature. The bending tree, almost like a dancer with arms upraised, occupies the right quadrant of the composition, while the harvesters work in the upper left in the bright sunlight. Below them, the undergrowth of leaves and flowers is wild and extravagant. And Benton is not without humor. Note the beetle perched proprietarily on the rock. Charles Sheeler's Water was painted 2 years later, and it shows a section of the dam of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Sheeler was also a photographer, and that influence is clearly seen in the way the windows, the facade, and even the cast shadow have been manipulated by the artist to emphasize the formal properties of the shapes rather than the picturesque nuances of the locale. This approach and the subject matter itself are a continuation of earlier 20th century works which demonstrated the ingenuity of man and his ability to harness the power of nature for his own purposes. Near the Thomas Benton, which was completed in 1943, is a work by a very young American artist who painted this canvas, Pasiphae, in the same year. That artist was Jackson Pollock, one of Benton's star students. But look how far he's moved away from his teacher. Pollock's vigorous method of applying paint paved the way for the gestural style of a new group of American artists, the abstract expressionists. They would alter the course of painting in the Western world during the following 2 decades. The style is termed gestural because the application of the paint indicates broad physical movement rather than careful brushwork. At the center of the picture, separate, jagged bolts of line hover above the reclining form, which appears to be a woman lying on her back with her arms and legs outstretched. It's interesting sometimes to see what happens year by year. Directly to the left of the Pollock of 1943 is a painting by Willem de Kooning. This 1944 image of a seated woman is startling. Placed only inches from the viewer, she is the antithesis of a goddess. With her hair in curlers, breasts bared, and enamel nails protruding from her hand, she poses with a strange, unseeing stare. Broad brushstrokes of color are strident, even garish, but de Kooning combines intensity with ridicule to create a compelling image that is striking in its visual power. As World War II raged abroad, many European artists of eminent distinction came to live and work in New York. One of those was Achille Gorky, an American painter born in Armenia, who came to this country as a child. If you look at this work, Water of the Flowery Mill, painted in 1944, you might think it was a watercolor because the actual pigment of the paint is so thinly applied to the canvas. Gorky is considered the most important and influential precursor of the abstract expressionist movement in New York. What is interesting about Gorky's technique, which seems so loose and free, even spiritual, is that he worked from squared drawings. Very often the composition was drawn and outlined on a piece of paper, which was then squared so that it could be enlarged for transfer to canvas. Of all the painters we will see in this installation, Gorky's method is perhaps the most traditional, but it is used in the service of very bold innovation. One of the attractive features of this installation is that the spaces are very open. We could more properly refer to them as areas rather than galleries. Rounding a corner becomes an adventure. Here, behind me, is the celebrated Autumn Rhythms by Jackson Pollock, completed in 1950. Remember the Pasiphae we just saw? Now that was perhaps Pollock's last easel painting. Here, we're off the easel and onto the floor. His series of poured paintings shocked the art world and definitely shifted the focus of avant-garde art from Paris to New York. Pollock's influence on the development of abstract expressionism was enormous. In Autumn Rhythm, Pollock first created a complex linear skeleton with black paint. Over this black framework, Pollock wove an intricate web of white, brown, and dark turquoise lines which produce contrary visual rhythms and sensations, achieving an extraordinary balance between accident and control in this unorthodox technique. Although Pollock's imagery is non-representational, Autumn Rhythm is strongly evocative of nature. This painting thrust Pollock, young as he was at 38, into the foremost conscience of a large section of the American public. The other artist of this time, also strongly gestural in his handling of paint, is Pollock's close friend Willem de Kooning. We've already seen an example of de Kooning's earlier work, His Seated Woman, and here we have two works further along on the scale of abstraction. The one on the left is perhaps his masterpiece. It's called The Attic, and the title of the one on the right is Black Untitled. It's impossible not to look at these two paintings and see other forms. In the smaller painting, you almost see a procession of faces in profile, turning left. In the larger forms of Attic, you can almost feel forms churning. Color has always been considered a key aspect of abstract expressionism, but in fact, some of their most interesting work was done in black and white. Black in particular was used often. De Kooning's palette of black and white, with touches of red and yellow, was determined in part, however, by the availability of inexpensive enamel paint. We are very fortunate to have a number of works by Clifford Still, an American artist whose work also belongs to the abstract expressionist school. The wall is hung chronologically, starting with a work completed in 1943. All are untitled. There's something primordial about the forms. You have the feeling that they're really torn from the cosmos and applied to the canvas. The different areas of color are juxtaposed like interlocking pieces of a puzzle. Still's colors are deep and rich. Small swatches of lighter or darker hues appear at the juncture of larger areas. The pigment has been applied thickly with a palette knife, creating a highly visible surface of short, energetic touches, like flames. Abstract expressionism encompasses two very different sensibilities. One, exemplified by de Kooning and Pollock, characterized by energetic brushwork and rhythmic compositions. The other, represented here by two paintings of Mark Rothko, contemplative in tone, resulting from much more subtle color harmonies and relatively static compositions made up of a few simple elements. By 1950, Rothko developed the compositional format that he was to use, with refinements and variations, for the next 20 years of his life. In these completely abstract works, horizontal bands of varying size and color dominate the large canvas, and they appear to hover on the picture surface. These forms are very calculated. There is nothing casual or haphazard in their placement. This hovering effect is produced in part by the halo created around the horizontal bands as they overlap the background color. It is enhanced also by the translucency of the paint, which was so diluted that it actually saturated and stained the fibers of the canvas. Completely calculated in their form and selection of color are these two works by Joseph Albers, who was an influential art teacher at Black Mountain College and at Yale University. These are part of a series he did in the 1950s entitled Homage to the Square, where he explored the effects of color on form and the visual effects created by placing different but precisely chosen colors next to one another. He kept exact records of the colors he used in each painting and determined the placement of each square and its color mathematically. I mentioned the use of black earlier. This large 1959 painting, Black, White and Grey, by Franz Klein, is again gestural in its method. Klein noted that the white areas were not merely sections of a background left visible after the black and grey had been painted, but were created as deliberately as the other colors, thus nullifying the usual distinctions we make between figure and background, between positive and negative areas. A useful juxtaposition with the Klein, and placed here for such an effect, is Robert Motherwell's powerful Elegy to the Spanish Republic, which is part of a series initially inspired by the Spanish Civil War. Remember, black and white are also the colors of mourning. Motherwell's elegies of the 1960s reflect his abstract expressionist affiliations in the gestural, painterly treatment of form, the rapid execution, and the integration of accidental effects such as splattered paint. This painting was executed on the floor rather than an easel, in the manner of Jackson Pollock's earlier poured paintings. The Texas-born artist Robert Rauschenberg combined the gestural painting of abstract expressionism and the poetry of the found object, celebrated by the Surrealists, in his multimedia works that first appeared on the art scene in the 1950s. We are pleased to present, in the Helen and Milton A. Kimmelman Special Exhibition Gallery, Robert Rauschenberg's 1/4 mile or 2 furlong piece, a multimedia environment that surrounds the viewer with sound, color, pattern, and imagery. It's an ongoing project that was begun by the artist in 1981. The work incorporates many of the sights, sounds, and materials encountered by Rauschenberg during his recent travels around the world on an artistic cultural interchange. In 1968, Ellsworth Kelly painted the Spectrum, and the very same year, the Metropolitan acquired it. The Spectrum makes a sweeping impression, and its minimalist technique is extremely interesting. The individual panels look flat, as if they'd been done with a paint roller, but in fact, they were painted with a brush very carefully. Kelly creates a specific yet discrete visual transition from one panel to the next, building up sequentially the dynamics of color in a lateral progression. Kelly also has a flat sculpture in the large sculpture court on the mezzanine level, and this might be a good time to show you what that installation looks like. This dramatic open space includes modern sculpture from the museum's permanent collection. The inaugural installation features works in metal, stone, and wood by such artists as Ellsworth Kelly, Henry Moore, Eduardo Chillida, Jim Dine, Louise Nevelson, and also paintings by Al Held, Matta, and Andy Warhol. Back on the second floor again with two works by Cy Twombly. The painting on the right, they are both untitled, is one of his finest works. You can feel the choreography of those lines. In his highly personal style, Twombly applies the mediums and techniques of drawing on a painted canvas surface. In this case, he uses colored crayon in a calligraphic manner. It's almost like writing. There are 7 horizontal bands, the forms large on the lower tier, and in the next register they become smaller, and their diminishing size almost furnishes a horizon to the picture. Just to the left of the Twomleys is one of Richard Diebenkorn's Ocean Park series painted in 1970. Diebenkorn is from the San Francisco Bay Area, and this series is in fact about the interaction between light and color as they evoke the California landscape. Diebenkorn is taking his cues here from Matisse when he utilizes the geometry of forms to contain the color. While most of the artists whose works we have just viewed were part of the abstract expressionist movement, there were artists at the same time painting in a completely figurative fashion. Perhaps the best known of American figurative painters of the 60s is Philip Pearlstein. He does precise, cold, calculated, and marvelously detached studies of models, always posed and in his own studio. The furniture or fabric seen in the compositions create a dynamic contrast with the flesh of the models. He is a very good portraitist and a painter of exactitude. A warmer, more intimate portrait can be seen in this painting by Fairfield Porter, a friend of almost all of the abstract expressionists, and a critic and a teacher as well as an artist. Porter was a great colorist, and his work shows the influence of Bonnard in its intimacy and in his use of muted pastel tones. There is a wonderful mood conveyed here, and the pensive subject is Elaine de Kooning, herself a painter and the wife of Willem de Kooning. Milton Avery is one of those rare American painters who throughout his long career successfully followed a course that wove a balanced path between abstraction and representation. All of his subjects, including Speedboat's Wake, which is seen here, are appealing in their familiarity, and they're painted simply with humor and gentleness. They delight the eye and lift the spirit. Color is Avery's primary means of expression, and here the almost unreal blue sky, the sea itself, almost black, and the line of the boat's wake make for a visually arresting yet recognizable image. When the prolific American painter R.B. Kitaj went to visit the legendary film director John Ford in 1970, the meeting was brief, but it remained pictorially vivid for the artist. In this painting, we see Ford on his deathbed, propped up against the pillows. As he recites the beads of his rosary, he summons up images from his favorite films. At the far left, the tall Irish Sergeant Mulcahy from Fort Apache. A couple dancing, a frequent motif in his films, and a desolate pair from Tobacco Road. Ford appears again at the bottom left, speaking through a megaphone. Above Ford's bed is a framed black and white photograph from the film he most liked, The Sun Shines Brightly. The frame to the left reads, The End. Kitaj creates a wonderful harmony of colors, and his paint is applied in the broad manner of Manet. Continuing in a realist tradition is this wonderfully rich scene by Romare Bearden. The Block, completed in 1971, is a tribute to Harlem, a neighborhood in New York City that nurtured both the life and work of the artist. Each of the 6 panels presents an aspect of life in Harlem, depicting such neighborhood institutions as the evangelical church, the barber shop, or the corner liquor store. Bearden takes artistic license in revealing the private moments of tenement life, as well as the exuberant humanity that exists in this prototypical city block. He enlarges shapes he wants to emphasize, such as the rat trap in the first panel, and the light bulb, a homage to Picasso's Guernica, in the 4th panel. The collage technique works extremely well, and scholars have suggested strong correlations between Bearden's mature work and music, especially jazz. A recent painting by Gregory Gillespie, completed in 1986, depicts a corner of the artist's studio. And what a marvelous clutter! Painted in extremely precisionist style, this work, titled Studio Corner, gives the viewer the illusion that many of these forms are actually collaged onto the canvas, when they are not. In fact, they're painted. And sometimes the real materials, like the wood easel, look painted when in fact they are the real thing. The whole painting is a wonderful series of juxtapositions and visual puzzles. Philip Guston painted the street in 1977. It exemplifies the raw, visceral themes that came into his work as he returned to figurative subject matter in the 1960s, after having been for many years one of the most lyrical of the first generation of abstract expressionists. The composition is divided into 3 vertical sections, each depicting a different state of being: passive decay, violent aggression, and total confusion. At the right, a large trash can is stuffed to overflowing with empty bottles, old strips of wood, a shoe, and other refuse. In the center, a barrage of disembodied hairy paws juts out, holding trash can lids as shields. These arms confront a jumble of skinny legs that seem to be thwarted by their own oversized shoes. Below, on the horizon, which is the street itself, a pair of spiders is poised for action. The street's unsettling color scheme of bright pink, red, and black, and its crude style of painting add to the turmoil and despair. As Guston wrote in 1974, his late paintings depict sort of Dante Inferno land. Another triptych is James Rosenquist's House of Fire of 1981. It is a dramatic composition of heroic proportions and fiery coloration, and it is painted on 3 adjoining canvases. Our attention is drawn to the central panel, where a bucket of molten steel, supernatural in its radiance, descends through a partially open window. Intruding from the right is an artillery of red and orange lipsticks, extended combatively. At left, a brown paper bag filled to overflowing with groceries is unexpectedly turned upside down, the contents miraculously remaining inside. The monumentality of Rosenquist's imagery has been influenced by his early experiences as a billboard and sign painter. Inferences of war, sex, violence, passion, industry, and domesticity may be drawn from these images. The painting can thus be read as a metaphor for the contradictory nature of American society today. The state of contemporary society is the subject of this final stop on our tour. The acquisitions in this gallery are recent works, all done between 1982 and 85 by 12 painters and 3 sculptors. The artists represented in this Age of Anxiety gallery, this is what we've called it, were born in Australia, Cuba, Germany, Great Britain, India, Italy, Poland, and the United States. The 12 painters share an expressionist style, figurative and often narrative. These painters also share concerns about the age of anxiety in which we live. The sense of reality in this room is to say there is no universal sense of reality. On that rather disquieting note, we end our tour of the inaugural installation of the Lila, Acheson, Wallace wing for 20th century art. I hope you've enjoyed seeing selections from our collection, and I also hope this introduction will encourage you to come to the museum to see some of these works in person. I'm Philippe de Montebello, and thank you for being my guest on this tour through the 20th century.